We're glad you're here. We're glad that you've joined us tonight. We are in a study through the book of Chronicles. We're in the 3rd chapter. Just kind of by way of kind of catching us up to what's happening. King David has passed, but before he passed, he had a longing desire to build a house for God. And the house that really had it wasn't like somewhere God was going to be able to be contained in, or like God was going to live there, but it was a place for men to come and commune with God. It was a place that man would have an opportunity to encounter God's presence. That was the intent. But God had made it clear that David wasn't the one that was to build the house. It would be his boy, Solomon. But that didn't deter David. David began to accumulate gold, laborers, silver, craftsmen. He went out of his way to make sure that all the necessary elements that would be required for a temple of this magnitude to be built were provided for Solomon. And so now Solomon's come and has become the king. And 4 years after he became the king, he begins construction. And that's where we pick up in chapter 3, the beginning of the temple build. And that's what's happening here in chapter 3. Now, in the beginning of chapter 2, if you were with us last week, remember in verse 1 where he says, "And Solomon determined to build a temple for the name of the Lord, a royal house, and a royal house for himself." A man determined to do something that God had ordained him to do. And that's always a good thing when God, has put something in your life and you just determined to do what God's called you to do, what God has ordained you to do, what God has set before you. And you always love that transition from determining to do something to beginning to do something, right? And that was kind of the process that happened in the 4 years of Solomon's preparations to build the temple. He was determined to do it. And then you read in chapter 3, verse 1, "Now Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem on Mount Moriah." Now, Mount Moriah was a place that God had designated for himself. It was the high place in Jerusalem. It was the very peak of the surrounding area there in Jerusalem. It was outside the city of Jerusalem, and Solomon's going to actually build the wall so that the temple is included inside of the city walls. And what's amazing is you look at that whole picture, is God had from time past had designated that place. When Abraham took Isaac to offer him up to the Lord, it was on Mount Moriah. And as he was going to pick up a dagger and stab his own son as an offering, an angel of the Lord stopped him and he said, "Now, Abraham, I know that you do anything for me." He wasn't looking for a human sacrifice. God was using Isaac as a type of a father offering up his son, because that's what God's plan was for his son. It was to be a type, a picture. You're going to find that in the scripture. There's a lot of types. There's a lot of shadows that you look at and you go, wait a second, that sounds like another story that happens down the road. That's what a type is. It's God saying, this is my plan, but it hasn't come to fruition yet, but it's going to come to fruition. And Abraham became a type of the father, Isaac, a type of the son, as he would be offered up on the altar there on Mount Moriah. And the angel stops him and he says, "Okay, you're not to offer up your son." And there in the thicket, there was a ram And God provided the sacrifice. Instead of Isaac, this lamb would be offered up, this ram. Earlier, as we were going through 1 Chronicles, David had sinned against God. He numbered the troops. He numbered the army that he had. And a plague came upon the land. 70,000 men died as a result of David's disobedience to the Lord. And as he began to pray, one of the prophets said, David, go up to Mount Moriah and offer up a sacrifice to God. And he did it. And in the middle of that whole instance, it was God revealing to David that this was the location that my temple was to be built. And he would tell his son Solomon, on Mount Moriah is where God desires his house to be, where this temple's going to reside. You see, God even took something that the enemy meant for evil, and he turned it out for good. And God often does that. He takes something that you just like, man, I blew it so bad. I messed things up so good. I messed things up really good. You ever been there? I have. Messed things up really good. And then God turns it around to redeem it, to somehow make something good come out of my bad, your bad. And it's through that whole instance that the revelation that was the place, that was the holy mountain, that was where God had designated for his people to meet with him. And so there on Mount Moriah, and it reminds us there in verse 3, where the Lord had appeared to his father David at the place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. That very location is where the holiest of holies is going to be built. So we're brought back to that instant. Look at verse 2. So he began to build on the 2nd day of the 2nd month in the 4th year of his reign. And this is the foundations which Solomon laid for building the house of God. The length was 60 cubits, by cubits according to the former measure, and the width with 20 cubits. Now, the Bible often mentions cubits in the Old Testament. A cubit was roughly 18 inches long. It was from a man's elbow to the tip of his finger. That's how, so it's about 1.5 feet is what a cubit would equal to. And so this temple, 90 feet by 30 feet. And within this main structure would be not just the outer courts, but the holiest of holies, the inner court and the holiest of holies, and then there would be the outer court. And this building that's being built was modeled after the temple that God had already given to the children of Israel by Moses, right? So there was already a model for it, but this is what's cool about this whole picture, guys, is that David had been given a vision, and he wrote down the exact dimensions of what this building was to look like before Solomon ever began to build. You see, this was all God's doing, and I think, you realize that God was the initiator of all of this, and the reason God was the initiator of it is because God wanted to fix man's dilemma. He wanted to fix that man has the opportunity, the ability to be forgiven for sin, brought into the presence of God, to have communion and fellowship with God, because that had been broken. And so God's the one who's, initiating all of this. Solomon is just fulfilling God's purpose. As he's beginning this build, as he's beginning to lay out this temple, it tells us in verse 4, the vestibule that was in front of the sanctuary was 20 cubits long across the width of the house, and the height was 120, and he overlaid the inside, check this out, with pure gold. Now, as we're going through this description, I know, there's so much here, but all of it is bringing us back to who Christ is. Because you look at this temple, and if you were to just look at the temple, it had nothing special on the exterior of it. It was just a bunch of stones. It didn't have no gold kind of surrounding the outside of it. And it was a picture of Christ. You see, Jesus didn't come into this world as royalty. He didn't have a crown on his head. You didn't identify him as someone that, that's the guy you need to follow. Matter of fact, in Isaiah's in the book of Isaiah, chapter 53, we get a little description of what Jesus would look like. And he says this: "For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, as a root on dry ground. He has no form or comeliness that we should see him. There's no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. And he was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he was borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted." I mean, just this whole picture of, it didn't look grand from the outside, but when you walked into the temple, pure gold, overlaid the whole interior of the holy place and the holiest of holies. And it was this idea that within that capsule, within that body, was deity. It was God's presence amongst us, and yet man didn't recognize it. Man didn't see it as anything special. Matter of fact, man rejected him. And this temple was to be a picture of Christ. That inside it was holiness, it was majesty, it was glory, it was deity. But on the outward appearance of it all, it was just common. And so this temple, this magnificent temple from the outside, it didn't look like anything magnificent, anything special. It was just rock. Rock was everywhere. You ever get to Jerusalem? Let me tell you what you're going to see. Rock. That's it. You kind of have this idea, I'm going to get to Jerusalem, it's going to be just like, beauty, and you just walk around and you go, it looks like I'm in Tomé. There's nothing, right? It's not anything magnificent. It's not something you go, but and the temple just blended in to the background of all of it. But inside pure gold overlaid the whole interior of that temple. Notice what he would say there in verse 5. "The large room he paneled with cypress, which he overlaid with fine gold, and he carved palm trees and chainwork on it." I mean, the decor was just incredible. Palm trees on the it was kind of engraved into the wall, and then inside the cypress, the paneling of wood, and then overlaying the wood was a layer of gold from the top, the ceiling. I mean, it was just totally encompassed with gold. And then check this out. "He decorated the house with precious stones for beauty, and gold was the gold from Parvaim." Now, that was like pure gold. It was the purest form of gold that was available in Solomon's day. And he said, I just used common gold. It wasn't 18 karat. This was, gold of great purity, and he identifies that. Look at verse 7. "He also overlaid the house, the beams, the doorposts, its walls, its doors with gold, and he carved cherubim on the walls." Now, the cherubim were a type of an angel, but it wasn't a common angel. It was these were the angels that were around the throne room of God. When you read the book of Revelation, you look at the angels that are around the throne of God, and all of them had a different face. The face of a man, an eagle, a lion. And an ox. That was the other one. I went blank there. But there was, and they represented the four gospels, and Jesus represented as a servant, represented as a king. The lion, the bull, the eagle, the deity, right? And all of these pictures that were there, that were laid out and inside the temple, carved into the walls, were these angels with wings. When Isaiah had an encounter with God, it says that Isaiah saw the angels flying, and smoke filled the whole temple. And he cried out, God, I'm a man of unclean lips. You see, he was in God's presence for the first time. He saw God's majesty, and all he can say is, I'm messed up. I'm a man of unclean lips, and I'm amongst the people of unclean lips. And God, we can't come into your presence. That was Isaiah's conclusion of all of it. The angel takes coal from the altar, places on his lips, cleanses them. All of these things were pictures for us, guys. It was also so that you and I would understand that God is holy, that God is righteous, that God is majestic. And as this temple's being built, I mean, you can't even try to put the number to the wealth that's being poured into this place. Precious stones, gold overlaid the whole room. The carvings of angels on the side of the walls with just gold overlaying all of it. Palm trees. They're going to find out he's going to mention pomegranates. It was just just incredible design, incredible labor, intensive, and then the wealth that went into it. Not just the labor that went into it, but the wealth that went into it with all of this gold that he's referring to here. Watch what he says in verse 8 now. And he made the most holy place. Its length was according to the width of the house, 20 cubits, and its width 20 cubits. He overlaid it with 600 talents of fine gold. A room 30 by 30 is what it equates to. And again, overlaid with fine gold. And look at verse 9. The weight of the nails was 50 shekels of gold, and he overlaid the upper areas with gold. 1.5 pounds, for every one of the nails that were used in there. And it was made of gold. And he just like, 1.5 pounds? Just give me 1.5 pounds, I'd be fine. Just one nail, that's all I want. How extravagant that this building is. Now, it wasn't the extravagant just for extravagance sake. It was extravagant because it was going to be the most magnificent house built because God deserved the best. That was their thought here. God had provided for them an enormous amount of wealth, and they were going to use it for His glory, so that the nations would have a place to come and meet with God. That was the intent here. Look at verse 11. This is cool. The wings of the cherubim were 20 cubits in overall length. One wing of the one cherub was 5 cubits, touching the wall of the room. The other wing was 5 cubits, touching the wing of the other cherub. One wing of the other cherub was 5 cubits, touching the wall of the room, and the other wing was 5 cubits, touching the wing of the other cherub. The wing of the cherubim spanned 20 cubits overall. They stood on their feet, and they faced inward. Now, here's the picture here. You have these two cherubs, and the wingspan covers the whole room. And their wings touch one another as they're standing side by side. And it was where the Ark of the Covenant is going to be placed. We'll get to that. And it's a picture that man had to go through the cherubs to be into the presence of God. Now, where did we find that before? When man fell, he was kicked out of the garden. Because in the midst of the garden was the tree of life, the trees of the knowledge of good and evil. Man had taken of the tree of good and evil, but so man didn't eat of the tree of life and stay in this state of sin for eternity, forever. God removed him, and he put two angels, two cherubs, to protect the garden, so that man wouldn't come back in and doom himself for eternity in that state of sin. And the picture is that in order to get to God, and into eternal life, and in order to have eternal life, you had to go through the cherub. And inside this holiest of holies were these two cherubs that were guarding, overseeing the ark. And all of it was to point mankind that what was ripped off from you can be restored back to you. The fall can be redemption. Man can come back into the presence of God. But there would be a cost. There would be a price. We're moving there. Watch this. And I want you guys to see all of this stuff is pointing us to a message. It's all coming back to a theme. And the theme simply is that God's desire is restoration for his creation. That's his desire for us. That's his desire for back then. It was God wanted to restore what was broken, what was stolen from us. Check this out. And he made the veil of blue, purple, crimson, and fine linen and woven cherubim in it. And he made in front of the temple 2 pillars 35 feet high. And the capital that was on the top of each of them was 5 cubits. Now, let me back up. So they had this 90-foot by 30-foot building. But what separated the holy place from the holiest of holies, you see, the holy places where the priests would go in and they would light the menorah, refuel the oil. They would have the showbread, 12 pieces of bread there on the showbread, making reference to the 12 tribes of Israel. And they would be working in that particular area, but only once a year. And only the high priest would be able to go through that curtain and go into the holiest of holies, and he would have to have blood in his hand to pour onto the covenant, the ark, as a sacrifice for the sin of the nation. That veil would have been about 10 inches thick. It was like a wall within itself. I don't know if you've seen like a heavy curtain, like on a stage or something. You're like, man, maybe an inch thick, and it's weighty, and you're just like, man, this thing is gonna endure whatever you throw at it, right? This is a 10-inch thick veil. Now, it was in Herod's temple. This temple gets torn down. Herod rebuilds the temple. When Herod's temple, that 10-inch thick veil, when Jesus died on the cross, it says that from the top down to the bottom, it was ripped. Torn. Signifying that the barrier between man and God has been satisfied. That's what we're going to celebrate next Friday and next Sunday, as we celebrate the crucifixion, the resurrection, is that the veil's been torn. There's no longer a barrier between man and God. That barrier's been removed. And it was a picture of Christ's accomplishment by paying the penalty for sin for us. Now we can enter into the holiest of holies. You and I have access to God. You don't got to go through a priest, because you have a heavenly priest, Jesus. And he intercedes for you, and he's able to go into the presence of God, and the blood that he offered up is sufficient to bring you into the presence of God. You see, all of these, again, all of them types, all of its pictures. When the writer of Hebrews in chapter 9, he uses this whole illustration for us so that we would grasp what transpired, what took place. And Hebrews chapter 9, if you have a Bible, join me. Hebrews chapter 9, look at verse 7. I think it's significant as we're looking at this. Hebrews 9:7, it says this: "But into the second part, the high priest went alone once a year." That's the holiest of holies. "Not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the people's sins committed in ignorance." The Holy Spirit indicating this, that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest while the first tabernacle was still standing. It was symbolic for the present time in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to the conscience. Concerned only with food and drinks and various washings and fleshly ordinances imposed until the time of Reformation, but Christ came as the high priest of a good thing to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation. Not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood, he entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled the unclean sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from the dead works to serve the living God. Isn't that cool? He says all of this picture of the Old Testament, it was all pointing us to him. It was all about him. It was about what he's done for us, the high priest that offered up himself. He didn't offer up a sacrifice for himself. He offered up himself. And he was the spotless sacrifice. He was the one sacrifice that's sufficient for all time. And this veil that would have been placed there, it was there to separate man from God, because of sin, man couldn't be in the presence of God. But because the payment of sin has been satisfied, you and I can come into the presence of God. Incredible picture. Now, outside the temple were two pillars. These pillars, 35 cubits high. That's 35, 50 some feet. 52 and a half, I think it is, feet tall. And they would have been at the front of the holy place before you had entered in. And they're significant because they had two names given to them. Watch as we move through this text. Look at verse 16. He made wreaths of chainwork as the inner sanctuary and put them on top of the pillars. He made 100 pomegranates and put them on the wreaths of chainwork. And he put the pillars before the temple, one on the right hand, the other on the left. And he called the name of the one on the right hand Jachin. The name of the other on the left was Boaz. Jachin means he will establish, and Boaz means he will provide strength. So as you go into the temple, that was the picture. God would establish you, and that God would strengthen you. Those are some good names. Because it really is, the purpose of the church is to establish you, to strengthen you, to establish you on a good foundation so that when you're walking through this world, you're not being shaken. We're told in Ephesians chapter 4, he says that the church is for the equipping of the saints, the establishing of the saints, so that the saints have a foundation underneath them, that they're strengthened as we gather together as the body of Christ, and we strengthen one another. And these pictures where when you go into God's house, this is the result of what happens. You're established and you're strengthened. And the two pillars outside signified that's what was happening as the priests were offering the sacrifices, and all of these things were taking place. Chapter 4, check this out. Moreover, he made a bronze altar, 20 cubits was its length, 20 cubits its width, and 10 cubits its height. Now, this is where the sacrifices would take place. 30 feet by 30 feet by 15 feet high, out on that courtyard outside the temple. And the first thing that you would notice as you walked into the courtyard would be this massive mound, 30 by 30 by 15 feet high. Now, I think our ceilings are close to 20 feet high, the top of the ceilings. Just kind of, you walk into this courtyard and you just look up, and there's men on the top that are offering sacrifices. And you just kind of look up there, and you kind of the whole presence there was sacrifice are being offered. Animals are being slaughtered. The aroma that would have been in that courtyard would have been overwhelming. If you like the smell of barbecue, it was on steroids. Because they're offering thousands upon thousands of animals. We'll see that here in a second. It was so numerous we couldn't even count them. I mean, that was the amount of animals being offered, and it just smelled like, just the cooking of animals taking place, the offering, the sacrifice of animals there on top of this altar. And it would always remind you that in order for me to get into the presence of God, there had to be a sacrifice. The very first thing that would come to my attention before I'd even get close to the temple itself would be the sacrifice. Again, a picture of Christ. It's only by his sacrifice that you and I can come into his presence. And so you would have this enormous presence of an altar there, the first thing you would take note of. Verse 3, and under it was I get ahead of myself there. Verse 2, then he made the sea of cast bronze, 10 cubits from one brim to the other. It was completely round. Its height was 5 cubits, and a line of 30 cubits measured the circumference. Now, the sea would have been where the water would be contained. Remember, you're on top of a mount. There wasn't like a running water. So they would literally have to have a place that they would store the water. And it was this enormous bronze sea. It's going to tell us here that it would hold an enormous amount of water. I did the calculations. It was about 2,400 gallons of water. If you got a swimming pool, that kind of helps you kind of put a picture here. And it was there for the priest to do their ceremonial cleansing. It was there for the animals. They'll have these little tinier little basins that they're going to have that they would use for washing off the courtyard and all the blood and all of the sacrifice that's taking place. Cleansing the utensils that are being used in the sacrifice, all there for that purpose. And so he kind of, you kind of get this humongous altar. You got a huge pool made of brass, just kind of, right outside the temple. Notice the sea. Under it was the likeness of oxen, encircled it all around, 10 to a cubit, all the way around the sea. The oxen were cast in 2 rows. When it was cast, it stood on 12 oxen, 3 looking toward the north, 3 looking toward the west, 3 looking toward the south, 3 looking toward the east. The sea was set upon them, and all their back parts pointed inward. It was a picture. As you had 12 oxen, kind of 3 facing, each direction, of the 12 tribes of Israel, and how they were to be the servants, and they are to be carrying, the cleansing of the water on their backs. And so you got this whole picture again where God is reminding them what their role is. They're there to serve. The oxen had the idea of strength and service. And you have all of this there inside the temple. Every time you walk in, you're reminded of these things. Every time you walk in, you see these visuals as you come into God's presence. Notice this. Incredible what goes next. Look at verse 5. It was a handbreadth thick, and its brim was shaped like the brim of a cup, just like your coffee cup, like a lily blossom. It contained 3,000 baths. There's the number, 3,000 baths. One bath was about 8 gallons, so it was about 2,400 gallons of water inside this sea. He also made 10 lavers, put 5 on the right side, 5 on the left, to wash in them such things as were offered for the burnt offerings. They would wash in them, but the sea was for the priest to wash in. So the sea was very specific and for the cleansing of the priest. The lavers were for the cleansing of the utensils and the offerings. And then verse 7, he says, he made 10 lampstands of gold according to the design, set them in the temple, 5 on the right side, 5 on the left. He also made 10 tables and placed them in the temple, 5 on the right side and 5 on the left, and he made 100 bowls of gold, right? Now the utensils inside of this holy place, 10 menorahs, 5 on each side. They would light that it would just illuminate the whole place. And it was always to be a reminder that God's presence brings forth light. It would have been a very, very well illuminated area with that many menorahs in it, and they were huge. As you look at the numbers here, you're just like, man, these things were enormous. When you get a chance to go to Israel, outside outside of the Temple Mount, there's a model of a actual menorah that's actually gold. They got it encased in plexiglass and alarms on it because it's made of gold, and you're able to stand, and you stand next to it, and it's above you, and you're just going, man, this thing's gold. That's just one. There were 10. They're inside this one room, and it's already in gold, laced already, laid all across it, and then you got this light shining on it. It's enormous, glorious picture here. Now, Here we go. There's 100 bowls of gold. Further, he made the court of the priest, the great court, the doors, the court. He overlaid these doors with bronze. He set the sea on the right side toward the southeast. Then Haran made the pots and the shovels and the bowls. Haran finished doing the work that was to do for King Solomon for the house of God. The two pillars, the bowl-shaped capitals, they were on top of the two pillars. The network coverings of the two bowl capitals, which were on top of the pillars. 400 pomegranates for the two networks. 2 rows of pomegranates for each network to cover the two bowl-shaped capitals that were on the pillars. He also made carts and lavers of the carts. See on the 12 oxen under it. The pots, the shovels, the forks, the articles, Huram, his master craftsman, made of burnished bronze for King Solomon for the house of the Lord. In the plain of Jordan, the king had them cast in clay molds between Succoth and Zereda. The Solomon had all these articles made in such great abundance that the weight of the bronze was not determined. Solomon had all the furnishings made for the house of God, the altar, the gold, the tabernacle, which is the showbread, the lampstand with their lamps, the pure gold to burn in the prescribed manner in front of the inner sanctuary, with the flowers, the lamps, the wicker trimmers of gold, the purest gold trimmers, the bowls, the ladles, the censers of pure gold. As for the entry of the sanctuary, its inner doors of the most holy place, the doors of the main hall of the temple were gold. So all the work that Solomon had done for the house of the Lord was finished. Solomon brought in the things which his father David had dedicated, the silver, the gold, and all the furnishings, and put them in the treasuries of the house of God. Now, he describes, all of these utensils, all of these things that were made just for the worship of God, and there was still gold left over. There was still, bronze left, and they brought them into the treasuries. Now, this is all for the Lord, and it's amazing because 7 years pass from the time that the temple construction begins till the temple construction ends. A 7-year project. All of these parts that were made was all designed by God. David just had become the architect that was writing down what God had described to him. And now, in verse 2 of chapter 5, check this out, incredible passage. Solomon assembled the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes, the chief fathers of the children of Israel in Jerusalem, that they might bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord up from the city of David, which is in Zion. Therefore the men of Israel assembled, the kings at the feast, which was in the 7th month. So all the elders of Israel came. The Levites took up the ark. They brought the ark, the tabernacle of meeting, all the holy furnishings which were in the tabernacle. The priests, the Levites brought them up. Also, King Solomon, all the congregation of Israel who were assembled with him before the ark were sacrificing sheep and oxen. Watch this. This is incredible, guys. That could not be counted or numbered for the multitude. It was just something that was so enormous, they couldn't even keep track of how many offerings were being made. As they're sacrificing to the Lord, as they're worshiping God. It was a sight to see. It would have been, the event of the century. The temple is now being dedicated. The temple is now being used for the first time. And check this out. The priest brought in the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place into the inner sanctuary of the temple, to the most holy place, under the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread their wings over the place of the ark, and the cherubim overshadowed the ark and its poles. The poles extended so the ends of the poles of the ark could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from the outside, and they are there to this day. Nothing was in the ark except the 2 tablets which Moses put there in Horeb when the Lord made a covenant with the children of Israel when he had come out of Egypt. Now, the ark of the covenant was made in the day of Moses. And it was where God's presence was. And so all of these years that have transpired, the Ark of the Covenant was still the holy place. It was still the one article that God had given Israel. And inside the ark was the 2 tablets of stone that Moses received as he was on the mountain. And on those tablets of stone was the handwriting of God with his finger. We also know in the day of Moses, Aaron's rod was in there, as well as the manna that God had provided the children of Israel. They're now missing. We don't know when they were removed from the ark, but the only thing that's in there was the 10 Commandments. And it's the only thing that really mattered. It was God telling us what his requirements, what his plan for mankind was, right? And it was all in there. And then check this out. It came to pass when the priests came out of the most holy place, for all the priests were present, had sanctified themselves without keeping to their divisions, and the Levites who were in their singers, and all of Asaph and Heman and Jeduthun with their sons, their brethren, stood at the east end of the altar, clothed in white linen, having cymbals, stringed instruments, harps, and with them 120 priests sounding with trumpets. Indeed, it came to pass when the trumpeters and the singers were as one, to make one sound to be heard in praising and thanking the Lord. And they lifted up their voice with the trumpet and the cymbals and instruments of music, and they praised the Lord, saying, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever. And it was a choir. It was a band. It was the cymbals and the instruments and the stringed instruments and 120 singers, and it was just this magnificent gathering, and everyone was there, all the priests, because the priests would take turns. One set of priests would do for 1 month, the next set of priests for the next month. All of them were here. And they're all worshiping, they're all crying out to the Lord, they're all sacrificing. I mean, this was the height of Israel's existence. And here it is, man, incredible, that the house of the Lord was filled with a cloud, so that the priest could not continue ministering before the cloud, because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of God. It was just God's presence just descended. The most holy place was now filled with the presence of God. The priests that were ministering, they said they couldn't even stand anymore. They just probably there face down, just overwhelmed with God's presence. The Shekinah glory of God, not the Chicano glory. Don't get those mixed up. The Shekinah glory just filled the whole place. And all of it pointing, all of it wanting you and I to understand that God inhabits those who seek him. He answers prayer when we cry out to him. When there's a sacrifice that's made on his behalf, that he's there. You see, Solomon is going to pray a prayer, and his prayer is going to go something like this. It's going to say, Lord, whenever we're going through trials or tribulations or famines or difficulties, whenever we pray to this place, toward this place, that you would hear from heaven. In chapter 7, verse 12 is where that prayer comes. And I want to read it to you because it's a very familiar passage. We quote it all the time. There in look at verse 12. We'll read this section. And the Lord appeared to Solomon by night, and he said to him, I have heard your prayer, and I have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. When I shut up heaven and there is no rain, or command the locust to devour the land, or send pestilence among my people, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sins and I will heal their land. Now my eyes will be open, my ears attentive to prayer made in this place. For now I have chosen and sanctified this house, for my name may be there forever, and my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. Guys, what made the temple the temple? What made it significant is it was a place of sacrifice. It was a place where the sacrifice would be brought before the Lord. Did you notice that in God's response there? He says, I will hear from heaven. He didn't say, I will hear from Jerusalem. He said, I'll hear from heaven. But they were to be facing toward the temple when they prayed. Why? Because in order to be in the presence of God, you need the sacrifice. And the temple was the place of sacrifices where man is able to be put on a right standing with God. And that's why Jesus fulfills the whole picture. That's why Jesus is the whole model of the temple, because his sacrifice gives us access to the presence of God. He hears from heaven because he made the sacrifice for you. And whenever you call upon him, doesn't matter where you're at, no matter what you've gone through, no matter how messed up you are, no matter how low you've gone, when you cry out and ask God to forgive you and to cleanse you, when you ask him to come in and just overwhelm you with his presence because you can't do this without him, he's right there. He hears from heaven because that's who he is. And he's the one who initiated it. You don't initiate it, he did. He's the one who hunts you down. He's the one who pursues you. He's been given the name the Hound of Heaven. I like that. The Hound of Heaven. Because he's always chasing after you. He's always trying to get you back into this place where he's saying, if you'll just come to me, if you'll just embrace what I've done for you, then you can be made right in my eyes. That's God's heart. It's his heart for this world that we're living in. Guys, we're in a broken world. And God's waiting for anyone who's willing to come and just say, God, I need you. I need the sacrifice you provided for me. The bulls and rams and none of it. There's no temple. There's no altar. There's no holiest of holies. They don't even exist. God, how do we do this? Because he fulfilled it all. You don't need a temple now. He's the temple. You don't need to bring a bull or a ram or a turtle dove. He offered himself. And all you have to do is seek his face. Cry out to him. And he'll hear you.